This is an alternate history scenario on what if the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth survived until today. This isn't the most realistic scenario, as the nation I'm about to showcase likely wouldn't stay united. So don't take this as an actual prediction, and more so fun speculation. We're allowed to have a little fun with alternate history, and entertain less than likely scenarios. Also, this is honestly the only way I see Poland-Lithuania not being conquered by its neighbors eventually. In the closing years of the Polish-Muscovite War, from 1605 to 1610 against the Tsardom of Russia and the Kingdom of Sweden, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth occupied Moscow, the capital of Russia. Here, the Seven Boyars in September of 1610 elected the son of the Polish-Lithuanian King Zigmund, Wladyslav IV, as a Russian Tsar on the condition that they would be allowed to maintain their religious orthodoxy, and he would convert. Seeing this as a great opportunity, King Zigmund accepted their demands despite wanting to convert the East to Catholicism, and allowed his son to rule the Tsardom of Russia. For the next couple decades, Wladyslav essentially acted as a puppet king to his father Zigmund, and Russia was functionally now an extension of the Commonwealth. This turned out to be great for Zigmund, as this would give him the opportunity to change his focus to his ambitions of regaining his lost kingdom of Sweden, since Zigmund used to be the king of Sweden, but was deposed by his uncle Charles IV. In 1612, during the Kalmar War between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, Zigmund saw an opportunity to strike, as Sweden was busy fighting the Danes. He didn't quite achieve his goals, however, as he only managed to cripple much of the Swedish army in Finland and Estonia, which gave Denmark-Norway the opportunity to decisively defeat Sweden and occupy the capital Stockholm. Eventually, in 1615, Sweden was partitioned between them, as Denmark was not willing to let the Commonwealth expand deep into Scandinavia and threaten the kingdom. So Finland and former Swedish Baltic lands went to the Commonwealth, and Denmark-Norway reunited the Kalmar Union once again. Zigmund was not happy with this, and relations with the new Scandinavian kingdom weren't great during his reign, as he never achieved his goals of regaining Sweden. But in 1632, Zigmund died, and the Commonwealth would have to elect a new king, which ended up being Wladyslav, who would now be king of both the Commonwealth and Russia. During his reign from 1632 to 1648, Wladyslav worked to unite the realms and create something closer to what we today think of as being the Commonwealth or Seveslavia, derived from the words for North and Slav in Old Church Slavonic. In the following decades, the Commonwealth didn't focus much of its resources on expansion into the vast Siberian wilderness, like the former Tsardom of Russia. They were only really interested in subduing the neighboring nomads and developing their new Russian lands west of the Urals. Another reason was that they were also much more involved in European politics, as they had several major powers right on their doorstep, but they did still expand into Siberia. Their lack of ambition for expanding eastwards didn't stop ambitious Russian settlers, who colonized much of Siberia in the hopes of achieving wealth by exploiting its vast resources, thus expanding the empire. Although some colonists, especially further east, were so far away from the heartlands that ruling them from Warsaw would be very tedious, and they formed their own smaller Russian kingdoms that were essentially vassal states of the Commonwealth. But despite all this, the lack of support from the Commonwealth did halt what could have been a much larger colonization of Siberia, and this would prove troublesome later on for the Russian colonists in the Far East. In 1685, after the Habsburg victory at Vienna, the Austrians formed a Holy League to force the Ottomans out of Europe. The Commonwealth saw this as yet another opportunity for expansion, as they had ambitions of forming a pan-Slavic nation and liberating the South Slavs under Ottoman rule. They also wanted the strategic Crimean Peninsula, so the Commonwealth, along with the Austrians and Holy League, invaded the Ottomans in the Balkans and eventually managed to liberate all of the Balkans, as well as Constantinople. The Austrian Habsburgs would, much to the dismay of the Commonwealth, conquer the Western Balkans, inhabited by South Slavs such as Serbs and Croats, as well as the Pannonian Basin, whereas the Commonwealth would occupy the rest, releasing Greece as an independent subject of the Commonwealth, but keeping the rest, including the great city of Constantinople. The Ottomans would be completely crippled, eventually being conquered on all sides, leaving the Turks in Anatolia as many petty kingdoms and warlords that wouldn't create any kind of Turkish nation before a century later. A decade later, the Commonwealth also expanded slightly further into the Caucasus region. During the 1700s is when the Siberian vassal states began having major issues, as the expanding Qing dynasty in China wasn't interested in a potential threat to the north, and thus started a series of conflicts where it sought to subjugate the minor Russian kingdoms. The Commonwealth, busy with keeping a hold on its lands in Europe and with the threat from the Habsburgs, neglected their eastern vassals, and all of them were eventually subjugated by the Qing. Following this clear neglect from the Commonwealth, the already mostly autonomous region east of the Urals also stopped answering to the king in Warsaw, and would eventually become the Siberian Republic we know today. That's become a mix of local nomad as well as Slavic culture. It would for many years stay on friendly terms with China and trade with them, although later, during the Chinese Civil War and following conquest of Siberia, it would enter into close relations with the Commonwealth once again, for defensive reasons. During the 7 Years' War, where the Commonwealth fought on the side of the French, they also managed to conquer some of the British allied Brandenburg's land, which they kept despite the French loss of the war. During the rise of Napoleon, the Commonwealth refused to adhere to the continental system, and this resulted in an invasion of the Commonwealth, which it suffered greatly from. When the final coalition would eventually defeat Napoleon, many areas that were carved out of the Commonwealth in the southern Balkans now remained independent. Constantinople and Thrace were now also part of the growing Greek kingdom. Following the Napoleonic Wars, the Commonwealth saw major political change and reforms as its elective monarchy evolved into a constitutional republic. It would also change its name to Seveslavia, derived from the words for North and Slav and Old Church Slavonic. This was when the pan-North Slavic culture and identity we know today also started developing. During the 1800s, tensions were generally high in Europe, as Austria was rising as the new dominant power in Central Europe, having united much of Germany, and eventually completely uniting it as the German Empire. In the early 1900s, the Greek and Italian nations were also on the rise, and in the mid-1910s, they formed an alliance as they had similar expansionist goals and were all authoritarian kingdoms. This all led to 1924, where the Great War began. It was the Central Powers of Germany, Italy, and Greece against the British Empire, France, Seveslavia, as well as Turkey, and several smaller countries that were caught in the mess. The war was long and bloody, but eventually after 5 years of fighting, the Allied powers won, and the borders in Europe were changed to essentially what they are today. Democratic governments were put in place, Germany lost all its non-German lands, and Greece lost its lands in Anatolia. Although the world hasn't seen any war on this scale since, during all this conflict, and after the Japanese-American War in the 1940s, the United States had grown in wealth and become the world's most dominant superpower. At the same time, the authoritarian quote-unquote Republic of China was on the rise in Asia, and by the 1970s, it had expanded its authoritarian ideology across Asia and countries around the world, like in the newly independent India, where an authoritarian government was supported and had help from China conquering Pakistan. The US also spread democracy and American culture across the world, creating an extensive network of alliances. This would lead to what we know as the Cold War, between America and her allies, and China and their allies, both capable of decimating each other with nuclear weapons. This Cold War is what led to the space race and moon landings by the US in the 80s and later China, which continues till this day, Seveslavia being a major player and champion of democracy along with America, as it's a democracy right on the border of the Chinese sphere of influence and one of the most prominent democratic nations in the world, second only to the US. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next video, which will be on what if the Russian Revolution never happened. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Also feel free to leave a comment if you have suggestions or anything to share. See you in my next video.